Hello, and welcome to another session with the Grouchy Historian. Today, we're going to kick off our AP American History Review by looking at the early contact and colonization of the New World. So in each of these series of slides that I'm going to do for this program, I'm not going to hit everything because I want to keep these fairly short, but I want to hit some of the highlights, some of the big themes that are likely to be on the test, or at least are sort of presented as the major topics for each of these time periods. What I'm not going to do is go over every individual date, place. Those will be in your text. I hope all of you remember to take really good notes during your class. So we're just going to hit some of the major themes. And then, of course, if you have any questions about anything, you can put it in the comments below, and hopefully we can start a discussion with other interested students or parents on any particular topic or issue that you want to learn more about. Okay, so let's get started. During this time, what are the major themes that they talk about? Well, they talk about exploration and early colonization, particularly the Columbian Exchange. We'll talk about that a little bit more here. But when we look at the early exploration and colonization of the Western Hemisphere, one of the things that we need to examine is, of course, what's going on in Europe at the time, right? Because the colonization was driven by competition between the major European powers, particularly the Spanish, French, Dutch, and English. And of course, the increase in their technical capability to have longer ocean voyages, increases of shipbuilding technology, navigation skills, and the ability to fund, because of course, everything takes money, these exploration and eventual colonization efforts, right? So the very first topic that the text spends a great deal of time talking about is the Columbian Exchange, right? Once Columbus discovers, and I know a lot of people are like, well, how can you discover something that was already there? Well, it was new to the Europeans. And once Columbus is able to chart his and bring back samples and discussions and lessons learned, as it were, from his voyages, we have what's known as the Columbian Exchange of goods, particularly plants, ideas, and of course, the inevitable discussion of the bringing of European diseases to the New World. And you'll see a lot of histories talk about the near extinction of several tribes of Indians, particularly in North America, from encounters with fishermen, traders, and other Europeans that have achieved, of course, some immunization to diseases like smallpox, but to which the native tribes had absolutely none. Once colonization becomes underway, the next major topic is the differences between the different economic, political relations with the native tribes, and most importantly, as we'll see downstream, the relationship with the mother country of the Spanish, French, Dutch, and English colonies. So what are some of these major differences? Well, the Spanish, of course, conquered primarily, as you probably have read, the Aztecs and the Incas in their search for silver and gold, but also, of course, a good chunk of what is now Mexico, Central America, and the American Southwest. The Spanish did not bring a large number of colonists, so their mostly male colonists had a lot of intermarriage with the local natives, and this produced sort of a tier of social order between Spanish, mixed race, and of course the natives. The French also did not bring a lot of colonists over. Both the Spanish and the French brought a great number of Catholic missionaries to bring the Catholic faith to the natives. We're still listening about this now. But the French also looked upon the natives as an opportunity for trading more than colonization. So as a result, other than a couple of large cities such as Quebec or Montreal, the French colonies were also tended to be sparsely populated. The Dutch primarily settled in what is now Manhattan Island and sought to control up the Hudson River Valley. This, of course, was probably one of the most significant geological and strategic features of the North American continent and what would be the English colonies, because not only was New York a superb natural harbor, but the ability to travel up the Hudson River from New York a significant ways inland toward what would become the New England colonies, we're going to find makes the Hudson River Valley one of the most strategically important and contested areas of North America. The English were probably the most different from the Spanish, French, and Dutch, as the English brought over a huge number of colonists to settle and farm the land. And as we will see in the next slide, their relations with the native tribes was much more contentious than the other three European powers, because they basically got into a number of contentious wars that we'll talk about on the next slide with the native tribes that the other countries did not. So the English actually intended to settle their North American colonies and brought large numbers of families to actually farm the land. All of these colonies had different relationships with the mother country, driven primarily by mercantilism, colonialism, imperialism, where the mother countries sought to control the economic flow from the colonies, some more than others. But there were always, in the early periods in particular, the colonies were fairly tightly integrated with the mother countries. Now, as the English colonies became more settled, we're going to see, of course, that there's differences among the English colonies, driven primarily by geography. Again, the New England, middle, and southern regions each had very different geographies. Therefore, they had very different economies, which, of course, drove not only their economic, but their political development. One of the things that I expect the test may discuss in detail is, of course, why was each colony started? Some of them were started for religious reasons, such as Maryland, which became a refuge for Catholics. Of course, the original Pilgrims, the settlers in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Some of them were started as purely commercial ventures, such as Virginia. So that's something that's very likely to be a potential test question, as are the differences in religious and economic factors for each of the colonial regions. So I would pay close attention to the development of the English colonies, both individual and as regions, their religious, economic, and political developments. So what are the major themes? Of course, the wars with the natives and their impacts. There's a number of Indian wars, as they are sometimes known, at the time. Some of these are very significant. If you look at one of the wars that I've studied, is King Philip's War, was probably the most significant war fought in the New England area, and was probably the closest that the native tribes came back to driving the colonists back into the sea. If you've ever seen a map of the King Philip's War, the native tribes banded together to resist the English colonists and drove them from most of their settlements in western Massachusetts. Similarly, other native tribes have banded together at various times in various regions, which you probably studied about, and had a significant effect on the pace of the colonists settling. Of course, the most important war, and there were numerous of them, were between the British and the French, right? The French controlled most of what is now Canada and a good chunk of what is known as the Ohio country, which is the modern states of Michigan, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania. And there was a great competition between the British and French for control of course, the major rivers in the area, since most traffic, large amounts of traffic went by rivers, because you didn't take trains or roads. And the British and French also competed for the allegiance of the various American native tribes in this area. Most of these wars were also driven by, although the colonists tried to escape it, they couldn't, the wars in Europe that occurred at the time. If there was a war in Europe, particularly between the British and the French, chances are that spilled over into North America. So you'll see that a number of these wars drove relationships not only between the English colonists, the French colonists, the Indians, but between the English colonists and the British. Of course, the most important of these was the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was significant for a number of reasons. It ended the French colonies in North America when the British signed the Treaty of Paris in the 1750s. The French ceded their holdings of Canada and the Western Ohio Valley. And of course, this also was the base, didn't bring total peace with the Indian tribes, but it stopped the French supporting them. Interestingly enough, I think a lot of Americans don't realize the importance of the Caribbean and South America to the colonists. At one time, the British actually had more financial stake in the various islands of the West Indies and the Caribbean than they did North America. We'll find later on, when we study the American Revolution, that may or may not be particularly emphasized in this course or world history, is the British were as much or more concerned in the later parts of the war with the French and Spanish who came into the war on the American side, threatening their colonies in the Caribbean and South America as they were in North America. The introduction and the rise of slavery in all of the colonies, including the Caribbean, South America, North America, helped the rise of what became known as large cash crops, primarily in the early colonies, tobacco, and in the Caribbean, sugar, were key to the economic developments of the Caribbean and the middle colonies, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, that survived and basically thrived on the production of tobacco. So we see that when the first slaves are introduced into the colonies in about 1619, that this immediately affects the economies of these middle colonies, and most importantly, the Caribbean and South America. All of the colonists, with the exception of the French and the Dutch to a certain extent, had slavery. The Spanish in the Southwest and the Caribbean and South America, and also the English colonies along the eastern seaboard. Most of the colonies also, once they were fairly well established, particularly the English colonies, entered a period of what is called salutary neglect. What this essentially meant was the colonists governed themselves. They had their own legislatures that passed their own laws. Nearly all the colonies had colonial governors and other government officials sent by England. But for the most part, as long as trade was conducted, because as always, it's all about the money, the English, for the most part, left the colonists to their own devices. Everybody was making money, everybody was happy. It was only occasionally interrupted by the Indian Wars. The French and Indian War was the exception to this. This was an extremely long, extremely expensive war. When the war ended, the English naturally expected that their colonists would help defray some of the costs of paying for the war. We're going to see the effects of this in the next lesson, because England's economic relationship with their colonies changed significantly after the French and Indian War and started to lead to the rise of colonial rebellion. Now, here's a few terms and conditions. Again, I haven't put all of these down. There are a number listed. Again, this is why I highly recommend getting a study guide, because they have an extensive list of people, places, dates that are probably important to make sure you memorize or know. I highlighted some of these here because they are thematic events and thematic terms that I think you need to keep in mind, particularly the effects of the various wars that took place, even though they don't cover them in any great detail. They were an inescapable fact of colonial life. And of course, if you've ever studied anything about George Washington, one of my favorite topics, you'll find that he, like many of the officers that served in the American Revolution on both the British and American side, got their first combat and command experience during the French and Indian Wars. Interestingly enough, the book also mentions the First Great Awakening. This was the first great spiritual awakening in America that was brought about by a wandering preacher named George Whitefield, who inspired some of the greatest sermons in American history and brought about sort of that first great renewal of religious fervor in the colonies. I think a lot of histories understate the effect that religion had on colonial life. It was key to nearly all the colonies and the daily life of people there. But it's good to see that they did at least mention it in the book here, and a few people that, some of the significant players in it, and mentioned that it did have an effect not only on colonial spiritual life, but it did have also a significant influence on colonial political life. This, of course, was the era of Protestantism, when they when religious freedom was important to the colonists, and it also helped shape some of their political opinions about political freedom. In effect, it started them down the road to believing they didn't need a pope or a king. So this is the first couple of sections of the American history. Again, the colonialism, the settlement of the colonies' economic and political relations with their home countries. It doesn't go into a great deal on the military history, but it does cover a good number of the Indian Wars. What's important to I think, note here is that the Indians, their allegiance was constantly competed for between particularly the British and French. A number of wars were started because of the French or the British stirring up their Indian allies to attack the other. And of course, the colonists were greatly dependent upon British military protection against the French until the end of the French and Indian Wars. And at this point, we start to see the dissolution, as it were, of some of the ties between the colonists and the mother country as the threat from French Canada and their Indian allies recedes. So this is our introduction to the first part. If you have any questions about a particular topic or person or incident, please leave it in the comments below. I think it would be good to have a running commentary because you never know who may have the same question you do, and I will attempt to answer all of your questions in a timely manner. Thank you very much for your time. We hope to see you for the next video.